Hi, I'm Lizzie,
And I'm Brenda.
and welcome back to Small Step Society. This is Season 2, Episode 11, On the Career Path, Part 2.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hi, welcome back to part 2 of our little series with our guests.
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. But before we get into that, we of course have our weekly segment, Song of the Moment.
Yes. So, Brenda, what is your song of the moment?
My song is Garden by Tommy Lefroy.
Oh.
Yeah, it has like a little, I wouldn't say catchy, but it's a very ear-catching chorus. And funny enough, Tommy Lefroy, you might think it's a person, but no, it's a band.
Wow.
Mhm. I didn't realize
plot
either.
twist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
What about you?
Mine's called Belong Together by Mark Amber. I feel like it's very popular on social media, but it's a very good song and it's very summery.
Yeah, it really
So-
is.
Yeah, I like it.
Nice. Well, with that, let's get back into our episode.
With our wonderful guests, Lauren and Kevin.
How do you build that almost like self-respect to say, I'm not going to work 80 to 100 hour weeks. I'm actually going to find something that I love. And even if it's maybe paying slightly less, I'm going to work my way up and stick with my passions rather than falling for the whole big company scheme.
I mean, I do the big company thing and I've found a lot of value in it, but I also don't want to hate my life.
Yeah, I didn't mean to discredit.
No,
the big
not at all.
company.
But that's the thing. I never thought I'd be working for a big company. If you hear my husband and I talk about corporate America outside of my 9 to 5, like you wouldn't imagine I do that. You wouldn't imagine he worked for IBM for years. But we do know there is value in contributing to the system we have built right now, right? You just have to figure out what that is and how to pull it from you. And this is going to sound very hokey and very self-help, but you're living your life right now. You're not preparing to go live your life. You're preparing to make other decisions down the road. But like this, we're living life in this room right now. What do you want out of that? I mean, you're not getting however old you are back. So like truly, your life is right now. It has already started. You've already moved on quite a bit of it. So you're preparing for what happens after graduation. That's really important. There's things you need to know about yourself to make those decisions. But value who you are right now in your experience. I mean, if it's painful, will it matter 40 years from now if you really grinded it out right now and hated all your years here? That's something personally I've tried to reflect a lot on, especially with my parents getting older and mortality and seeing friends who are sandwiched between raising kids and aging parents. I mean, that's going to happen and that's going to be painful. Like, how do you find joy in that? I think you need to know who you are well before you get to that time and just reflect that, your life now does matter. Like, how many credits you get, that's awesome. That's very cool. But it's not, and like, no one cares what my GPA is anymore. I don't think anyone cared what my GPA was when I did graduate.
Right.
Like, so truly, the things that I think we put upon you guys to really value, it's not what you should be valuing about your existing life. Like, you guys have to make those decisions for yourself. Like, what do you want your time to be? And when you reflect back, do you want to have enjoyed your years?
Yeah, I've probably hired 200, 250 people in my career, at least. Interviewed 8 times that. If somebody puts like their GPA on their resume, I'll actually put them at the bottom of the stack. I look for, and maybe this is unfair, but I do look for some indication of where does this person's energy come from and what gives them energy. And if there's no evidence of that in your profile, I think one of the first things you have to do is to figure out that just fundamental piece of, is it cities or rural? Is it international or domestic? Is it quantitative or qualitative? Think of the different spectrum-based comparative metrics and explore enough of them so that you can start to get a shape of, yeah, I did that and I hated it, but I'm so glad I thought I would, that's what I would want to do. And then I did it and I was like, not so much. But then that opened the door to the next thing. And let me tell you about that. Like, that's the sort of story that's compelling. I cite this there's a professor who was at Yale, a guy named William Deresiewicz, who left Yale because he was so disappointed with what higher education was doing to young people. And he wrote a book called Excellent Sheep. And he talked about we've created a generation of hoop jumpers, exceptional hoop jumpers, you know, jumping through hoop, jumping through hoop, jumping through hoop, jumping through hoop, but no sense of why they're doing it. and that's the role of education. So it's not young people's fault. It's not students' fault. I don't even know if fault is necessarily the claim. It's just we've drifted into a zone where our educational institutions are prioritizing disproportionately sets of activities which are not enough to create happiness. You know, Dr. Laurie Santos, she teaches a class at Yale. The most popular course at Yale, in the whole history of Yale, every year a quarter of the student population takes it. What do you think that course is on? It's on the science of happiness.
I've seen that,
And
yeah.
she has a podcast called The Happiness Lab. And I'm not, you know, some of this happiness research feels a little bit hokey to me, but the fact that there's demand at a school like Yale overwhelmingly for a class on the science of happiness shows you that people aspire to have more of that in their life. And she created that class. She's an evolutionary biologist who researches monkey behavior. And but she observed these students suffering, and then all of a sudden was like, what does the science say? And unpacked it and realized, whoa, the science says this is what makes us happier, but we're doing almost everything opposite. So
Right.
again, we should not be surprised that there's a challenge right now, right? And so I don't want students to feel guilt if they feel like, oh my God, all I've been doing is checking boxes and being a hoop jumper. How can I not be a hoop jumper and check boxes? Oh my God. No, just don't try not to sort of like have that self-doubt and you know, maybe take a risk here and there or go explore. Like that's what I teach my children. Like we fish all the time. We fish all over the place. And part of that is because they're out in nature and they're experimenting with things and they're getting excited. And then they think, oh, what if we could go to Algonac and fish for sturgeon at the end of August? Yeah, that's our trip next year. And, you know, so having something to look forward to that's non-academic, it's life. And like, I just think that helps weave a broader tapestry that you can draw from as you kind of go through the hoop jumping part.
Yeah. I feel like that's honestly, in some sense, this podcast is a bit self-serving because if you look at our viewership count, we don't have a lot of viewers, but I feel like what we do take away from this, at least speaking for myself, is even just going through our episodes, like I learned so much about the value of connection, the power of doing whatever your heart feels makes you happy. Like I learned a lot about this, and yes, it is completely different from what we typically undergo in our real lives. So it's just so interesting that like once you start exploring, you do see all these connections that aren't talked about on TikTok or aren't talked about on Reddit, you know? It's just completely different. And I think we've been fortunate enough to actually have our eyes opened at least a little bit to, I guess, the reality of diversifying your experiences. But a lot of people just go through their 16 years of school and they just live it.
Well, I think some of that, and I say this to the administrators of the university who are watching, I very much valued my education here and continue to, but it's also a business. And as someone who's in business, and I track how things perform, right? I have key performance indicators I set at the beginning of the year where I think we're going to be and what our goals are. How do you measure students' happiness? You can measure their GPA. You can measure how many courses you offer. You can measure, you know, surveys on how successful they are longer, but it's really hard to measure those intangibles. I struggle with in marketing, right? Like if someone didn't click on an email, but they read it and then 6 months later act on it, that's an intangible I can't put a KPI on, but I have to make the case for my, you know, my stakeholders on why they should fund things like that and awareness. I mean, colleges have to perform and show results to continue to get students and to continue to make money. It's part of a system. So it's in their benefit also to measure and value a lot of those more traditional markers because it continues what they're able to do. So I think maybe even as a society and universities and kind of our education system is how do we better measure or put up marks for, well-being, mental health? Like, are you going to be a good contributor to a society? And all behind the scenes for people, we had a camera fail. You guys didn't melt down. You adjusted and we kept going. That's huge. That's, if I ask you in a new hire and I come in and I say, hey, how do you deal with difficult situations or adversity? That could be an example you bring to the table. I mean, those little things and being able to come back from that, those matter because not everyone can. I mean, so really think through what you want to, like, very hokey, but what your key performance indicators for your life are. Are they going to be your salary? How many years you grind it out? What kind of house you live in? Or are you going to value who you find as a partner if you want to grow a family, how happy you are while you do that, how much time you spend with your loved ones? I think that's something you have to evaluate for yourself and decide what you want those indicators to be on if you're living a good, happy life for yourself.
Yeah.
And the University of Michigan is, I mean, you look at President Santaono's declarations, they're forming an institute on wellness and mental health. But I think they're doing it because there's a mental health crisis. And, as a university, we've been sitting on like one of the top psychology departments for 50 years. They could have started this 20 years ago, but there wasn't a motivation until there was a crisis. And, but, I do think places like the University of Michigan are responsive. And it is an institution that is, trying to provide for a broad range of experiences. I really do think that I wish more people could have the experience of being in an institution like this. But so it isn't just places like this that basically select the best hoop jumpers, which they do. It's also people that want to try to create really good human beings, but that requires more than just being great in the classroom.
And we see that pivot in helping with mental health in the corporate world too. I think everywhere I've been, there's been massive initiatives or massive even safety nets that the company has built into benefits to try and help support their workers. I mean, even if my dog gets sick, my company now has a program that can come in and help me so I can continue working, but to make sure that I have the support I need for that. I mean, so I see a lot more response in the corporate world too. I mean, cynically, you can then, it's part of keeping their workforce happy and healthy, but I think it's awesome that we're even doing that because it didn't exist before. I mean, I think so many people, depending on where you came from and your background, just didn't have access or the knowledge on how to tap into those resources. So having your HR company all of a sudden, putting it right in front of you, that's awesome because, my family's been really great and I had exposure to it, but, other people on my team, maybe it was something that they weren't talked about, but now it's publicly, the university's putting focus on it, your company's putting focus on it. There's ads for it now in the world where like 10, 15 years ago, that was a no-go. I mean, my team knows I'm in therapy because to them, I want them to know it's safe to come talk to me if they need to. They don't have to, but I'm a human with my own messed up world that I'm happy to make space for to share with them. Like, you don't need to nail it out of the park every day. There's days where maybe I have 30% to give, but the company recognizes that. And I think you'll see a lot more places understand that everyone where they're coming from is very different and they have different needs that help them give their all in that specific day. So I think I agree. I think there's, a lot of financial motivation behind it, but I think there's a lot of altruism that can back that up.
Yeah, I know you mentioned like how you build that into your teams and how you build like the mental health happiness case, but I was wondering, how do you actually make the case for that within your team? Because some of that is only just starting to make its way into the corporate world. Like, how do you make the case for actually embedding those initiatives and being kind of the trailblazer within your team?
Yeah, so I'd argue there's a lot of really powerful leaders who have come before me that I've kind of, when I've stepped into manager roles or leadership roles, I'm very much like, what would they do? And I've been able to kind of, until I feel like I can fill those shoes on my own, very much pulled from other leaders I've seen. So I think there's a lot of people who have come before me, and particularly a lot of strong women who have helped show and shape where I am with that. But for me, it's built into our goals. I have a goal as a leader that comes from the very top CEO that's like, how is my team in the culture? So for part of that is my team has to block 8 hours of white space in their week that meetings don't get booked on. I don't care if it's all day Friday. I don't care if it's 2 hours, whichever day. And if you need me to block it on your calendar, I will and cancel meetings for you. But like find time to sit and think or stare at a wall. I mean, honestly, replying to emails or chats or writing documents, that's not where the great work happens. The great work happens like when you're washing your hair. I mean, honestly, building the time for you to think and work through things is massive on my team. The other thing is, if you're not feeling it or you're having a struggle, let me know. And then you don't even have to tell me why, and then you can nope out for the day. Like, I've been on calls with people where they've dropped because they're mid-panic attack, and they're afraid, like, on the side that I'm going to be angry at them. I'm like, good Lord, no, please don't be on a call where you feel like you're dying. Like, making that space for people to, share, I'm having a bad day. I don't need to know the details, but that's enough for me. Go take care of yourself, because unless you're at your best and you're comfortable with where your family's at, you're just not going to be able to show up to work.
Right.
So quite honestly, for me, you being a happy, healthy individual is much better for me as a manager, because you can show up and contribute and have good ideas. So we build a lot of, all right, block your calendar. I want you to have these space. So we build those into some of our goals to really make sure we have the time in place. I don't force people to attend any of the mental health webinars, but I make sure I elevate them as well. And if I'm having massive mental health challenges that impact the work, like when my dad was first diagnosed, I let my team know. I'm like, hey, the next 2 weeks might be a little rough for me. So if you feel like you're picking up more slack, or I feel like, hey, can't think, let me know. Let's have an open dialogue about it. So I think, honestly, having the space for those conversations is the first step.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think the science is increasingly there.
Mm-hmm.
I think a statement without evidence is an assertion in the business world, and the language of business is a business case, and a business case is predicated on evidence. And when you don't have revenue associated with it, you can lean on the science. And I remember first getting interested as I was doing the early exploration in the class I teach about what I wanted to have in the curriculum. And I was reading a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And there was a study done by a health insurance company, Cigna, who, they're trying to keep people out of the doctor's office, because anytime somebody needs a medication, has a chronic condition, whatever have you, it's expensive to them. So they had one of their primary focuses for a whole year was loneliness, and they determined that the mental health consequences of the physical health consequences of loneliness are the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you create conditions where so many people are alone so much of the time, and I see this happen to young people too, who in college, there's people everywhere. They never think I'm going to be alone. And then they go off and they go to work. And what is the biggest growth in real estate in urban centers? Single bedroom apartments. What do people do? They work long hours. They go hole up in their apartments. They watch Netflix. They order some delivery service. They get their groceries delivered. They don't interact.
Mm-hmm.
And they're isolated. And again, so should we be surprised that there's
Right.
So I think it's like, I often feel like I've spent a good deal of time with more traditional communities, especially when I lived in Africa, and seeing just how joyful and happy they are with almost nothing. And a large part of that is just like, how have we operated as humans for most of our existence? We all hung out and we did a lot of stuff with other people. We didn't sit alone in a cubicle, have people yell at us, and then go home and sit all alone and eat takeout and watch Netflix and then
Right.
get up and do it again all day the next day and all day every day after that. And so, there's increasingly credible science that backs up a lot of this stuff. So when companies are making policies and we see this a lot when you look at the demand for executive education at the Ross School, it isn't for accounting. It's for mental fitness and mental health. When you look at high performance athletes, it's not the little bit of training that makes your calf muscle a little bit stronger necessarily. It's how do you create the mental capacity to perform under incredible pressure? And so I think increasingly there's a recognition that it's not just about a protection of the downside risks of mental health. It's also an awareness that higher performance comes from mental health, and that's something we all should celebrate.
Right.
And the science backs that up. A lot of the science comes out of the University of Michigan, so as well as other institutions, but a lot of it comes out of here, and so finding ways to creatively identify information and evidence that can support something you really believe in is the application of an academic skill to a real life situation. And so I wish young people did that more, or there were more opportunities for young people to do that.
Yeah.
And this is just one of the spaces where that can happen.
Yeah, I think so. The topic of loneliness and how you balance that, I think, brings up the question of, especially post-pandemic, there's a lot of remote work opportunities. When I'm looking for jobs, every single job is remote. And I think there are some benefits to that in terms of, like you said, Lauren, creating that time for yourself to just think instead of just working all the time heads down. But obviously, you're alone all the time when you're remote. So how do you think, like, what is your stance, just generally speaking, on remote work?
I can speak on this one. I've been a remote employee since 2008,
Wow.
and I love it.
Okay.
However, I started my career in an office. I travel a great deal. I don't even know how. I fly well over 100,000 miles a year. I usually go to Asia twice, Europe 4 to 6 times, a couple different stops in the U.S., and maybe one other random thing. I got to go to Azerbaijan in a couple of weeks. And so those are super intense experiences. And then I can come back, and I love living in this community, by the way. And I feel like for me, the freedom of, I have nature, I live right on the Arboretum. And so I go out in the Arb every single day, for a run or a walk my dog, go out with my kids, we fish on the river, whatever have you. And like, that is a gift that is harder if you spend even just 20 minutes each way commuting. Like, that's the time you could have gone. So I think I would discourage undergraduates from doing remote work for their first job.
Right.
But I think as you get older, especially when you need a little bit of flex, like my kids go to 2 different schools. They're not that far apart, but like it's 2 different schools. And one does swimming, the other is karate and soccer. And it's like, I want to be active in their life. And if I'm commuting and doing all this stuff in an office, I can't do all those other things. So I think at certain stages of life, remote work can be a real true gift. And when you look at the data and the evidence, remote work is a higher quality of life. But I think straight out of undergraduate, I think that would be tough.
Yeah, it's scary to me.
I think so, because I think you inherently build a community of peers when you first get out. I mean, that's that loneliness jump, right? Like if you're in a office environment, it's easier to plug into business resource groups that kind of can help you build a community. Reach out to other team members if you need help. I love remote work. I've been remote since everything closed down that week in March with COVID. Before that, I worked remote 2 days a week, even though I could bike to work 4 miles away. And I love it. I think I'm able to, use my time productively. Majority of my team is remote as well. And honestly, being remote is better than us being in the same office, being on the same call. Anyways, internationally, there would be 7 of us all lined up in cubicles on the exact same call with someone in Germany. It'll be interesting to see how it changes. Since Amazon has recently put their return to work, I think we'll see how much of a trend that does set. I'm very curious to see that myself. I think there's huge value, though, in gathering the team and working together. So our goal for at least my team next year is to have 2 face-to-face meetings where we can all gather as a team, bring in stakeholders, and kind of, who are we as a team? Let's make sure we're remembering each other's humans. We're just not on a calls. I mean, there's very real personality and conversations that can happen in person that don't always happen over FaceTime or Teams or whatever technology you use. So I see the value in coming into an office, particularly if that's how you work. Like if that's something you value, go for it. Like no one wants to take that away from you, I think. But I really value remote work. I'll probably continue to fight for it in my own career long term. But yeah, I see I see the value. We have leaders who see the value. And I think depending on, honestly, your function, I think there's huge value in marketing and certain people being close together for periods of time. If anyone from my team is watching this, I don't plan on us trying to go into the office. But, you know, it'll be really interesting to see how it continues to change. I think technology has gotten us to the point rapidly, really quickly, where it's really functional and really easy. But I know it's hard. I mean, I hear laundry in the background screaming at me every day when I do work. There's other things that do demand your time when you're home, and you have to set, I think, some boundaries and know what's going to make you thrive in a home work environment. I live in Saline, which is a very tiny community. I can walk to the coffee shop and work from there. I can walk to the grocery store. I really value living in that kind of really tiny, I don't have to get in a car for weeks at a time if I don't want to leave the city limits. I love that. That works really well for me, the way I work. But other people, if I were in a more remote environment, like where I grew up just down the road in Lenawee County, I would be out of my mind working from home because I would be backing up to a cornfield with no way to walk to anywhere else.
Yeah.
So I really think it depends on where you're at and what you need and what you value, and kind of how you see yourself succeeding long term.
Yeah, look at one of the things we cited in the class I teach was the World Happiness Report came out halfway through the semester, and I was reading it, and Denmark is always in like the top 3. And then I was doing some research. I was like, well, what makes them so happy? I mean, this is a cold, gray place with long winter, and one of the things that they do, well, they're very effective at capitalism. They average 32 hours a week of work. We average 47.
Yeah.
But one of the things they do as individuals is the average citizen in Denmark is in at least 2 different clubs. And it's like, so it's, again, I think you look at this conversation, how much of this conversation have we spent on work? 90, 95%? You know? So much of life is actually, and I actually think you get enormous benefit professionally by having a life outside of work. And, you know, clubs can be, I sometimes, when I walk through the arb, at first I was like, what are those people doing? And then I discovered, because I didn't grow up with Harry Potter, they were playing Quidditch, running around with like a broomstick and like sending something through a hoop. And I was like, well, good for them, you know? Or like I'll go out for a run and I'll see a group of like 30 people from all age groups, and they're all out bird watching. And it's just like, you know, finding something, again, knowing what you like enough, and then like joining a club for it. I run with 3 other guys. We call ourselves the moderately paced middle-aged dads. And one guy is a former Navy SEAL. One guy is a doctor. I've already talked about my career, and then another guy is a consultant. But we're all just kind of like, our kids are still young, but not in the infancy stage. And like we got to build friendships again, because you get so ensconced in career and family that you forget about all that stuff. And so, you know, we kind of made it a club, you know. And so I think finding some way to connect with people, even in small little ways a couple times a month, can be a really powerful way, if you are remote, of making sure that you're getting out.
I think doing that with intent and being deliberate and scheduling and making time for it has been the only way I've been successful. I years ago, used to climb regularly at a climbing gym. My brother was my partner. We had a reoccurring date that was standing, and like, if you had to cancel it, there better had to be a reason, because we'd go, there'd be people we see and talk to. I might not even know a woman's name, but like, I've seen her the last 30 weeks in a row, and I know what all her life issues are because we sit there and watch other people climb. So that's something where you have to be deliberate about it. As you get older and you become an adult, there's not the school, like you said, club sports here aren't as big as they'd say in Europe. I mean, a lot more of your community is around your club sport that's not tied to your university. It's not tied to your high school. It's not tied to like your work softball league. It's a completely separate entity that's probably more community based than even what we're in here. So finding those opportunities to break out. I have standing brunch with a group of girlfriends who are from high school and not even part of like my career or day now, and we're all very different. But still, how do we navigate as a 30-something in like this world? You know, where do we plug in? How do we make, you know, things we don't let ourselves talk ourselves out of? I think it's very easy with how busy you are to say, hey, not this week, or I don't have the bandwidth. And there's times where that is 100% valid. You don't have the energy or time to commit. but often getting out the door and going to that thing will ultimately benefit you more than sitting at home for that next hour. So it's hard, but you do have to carve out the time and make sure the people around you help you prioritize that. Yeah, I'll just disappear on a Saturday and my husband knows it's because I have the standing date. There's no like, hey honey, I'm leaving. It's I need this time and you want me to have this time so I can show up and be here for you later. So
That's right.
I feel like we had an episode on power of connection, and kind of going back to like the science and how we're actually built to be connected, is that we talked about how even our neurons are like firing to connect with the other neurons next to them. Like, yeah, we were like biologically meant to be connecting with others, but with the remote work and even like some of our classes are fully remote and we don't have an interaction with students, with a professor, it can be a little hard. And kind of going into the career world too, if you are doing fully remote, that can add to like the loneliness. Yeah.
I feel like what I've experienced, like just looking at my parents who are fully remote now pretty much after the pandemic, I think like the biggest thing I've noticed is just the struggle in finding that work-life balance, because you are now, yes, you do have more time to yourself, but at the same time now your home is your workplace and your workplace is your home.
Yep, that's a real I feel that. Like I live in a open floor plan house that doesn't have a lot of doors. And so when my kids come home, I have to go from like work brain to dad brain in 6 short steps.
Right.
And I'll sometimes have to like really be intentional about just shut my eyes and breathe deep a few times for a few minutes before I go and engage with my kids, or my partners, or, whatever she's been dealing with that day. And like, just to sort of be able to make those transition, because there are a lot of complications where it's hard to set boundaries in a home office. In my ledger, remote work is a win, but
I found it easier, I think, to balance work life remote because I don't bring the laptop. Well, the laptop's permanently home, but it's more of a like set workstation that I can shut a door on.
Right.
Where if I brought my laptop home before, there'd be like, oh, I can check one more thing. So when I come in the morning, it's already set. If I'm at home, I have my work phone. I have a personal phone. I'll lock my work phone in my office when I walk out. I might do one more check before I go to bed, mainly because I have people on the Pacific Coast, so I want to make sure I don't leave them hanging. But I step away, and the expectation from my team is they step away too. If there's an emergency, they know how to get a hold of me, but chances are they're all adults. So if there is an emergency on a Saturday, I'm not someone they're reaching out to till Monday morning. And so for me, understanding even my role in my team's life, and if they even need me at those times or even would want me involved, that helps me walk away from things as well. But there's a lot of times where I step outside and play with my dogs where I wouldn't have done that if I worked in an office. I wouldn't have gotten those extra 15 minutes. I probably would have stopped by somebody's cubicle, tried to talk through something in a presentation, which has its own value at certain times. But for me, probably going outside and listening to the birds and taking a deep breath probably saved somebody in the next meeting from me being more cranky than I needed to be. So I have found it helps a lot more with it. But the partner and shifting your brain to engage is something that's very real. And I had to work on very early on because when we first started the pandemic, my husband worked remote as well in the basement. And we'd both come back up from working and be desperate to socialize with each other outside of work. Well, he comes home from the library. He's been socializing with the public all day. He does not want me coming out of the office and downloading my brain onto him because he's already tired. So understanding where each other are at that time and place is also really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's why it's also important for the workplace to kind of be mindful of that and, for example, like provide that work phone or provide that work laptop. Because I think even with me, like I work remote part-time, and the problem I have is, yes, I have my work laptop, but I also have Slack on my phone, which I probably shouldn't have. But it's very hard to like pull yourself away from that mindset of, well, if they need me, I should be there because it's my job. And it's just challenging to do, I feel like.
For me, it's easier because marketing is very critical. It's a huge part of the engine that drives business and capitalism. Someone's not going to die today based on if someone can get a hold of me.
Right.
So it's very easy for me to kind of try and frame that and put that into place. There may be, some impacts on certain things if there was something on the site that went wrong or I need to respond to a leader, making sure I'm available within reasonable time sets for that. But I don't want to overvalue the role I play in the world and the ability for somebody to get a hold of me after hours as well is really, I have to take a very hard look at what I contribute, and I might not be that important for someone to get a hold of.
I think, yeah, that makes me think of like the question of when you're in a position where you have someone who's higher up than you, and you feel that pressure to keep doing well in your job because you need to move up in the company and you need to get to the next level, and you need to jump through the next hoop. How have you both dealt with that kind of, I guess, dilemma of when do I set that boundary and say, okay, I don't need to reply to this text right now. I don't need to work long hours overnight to get this thing done. It can wait until the next day or the next morning.
I struggle with that. I think I probably work too much. I'm a COO that I was put into this job to take over. And so I feel like I'm constantly having to prove myself, and, oh, hey, we've got a call with Taiwan at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. Sure, I'll do it, and I fit it in, and it's all right, but I know that there's a cost, and I wish that I didn't have to sort of face that pressure of kind of up or out. I do think that that's a reality of American work culture. There's not a lot of situations where you can just be like, all right, I'm 51. Like, okay, I'm just going to stay right here for the next 15 years. Like, no, you're going to get laid off if you're that static. And so there is a real cost to that, and I haven't done a very good job of navigating that, honestly. I mean, I am very engaged as a father. I'm very engaged with my partner and with my friends and other people in my life. But like, I definitely work too much, and part of that is the pressure of performance.
Right.
We're measured, I mean, you in different ways, but measured on output at the end of the year. I'm given a set of numbers that show if marketing worked, and if we swung and missed or we had failures, there's absolutely, I mean, my boss isn't going to yell at me if there's very real justifications for why those didn't happen. They're learning opportunities, and maybe we need to reset our bar for next year, but they matter, and I have to make sure I'm collecting them. I'm probably better at it certain years than others. I'd argue sometimes probably look at the leader and see if it's someone you want to be working for. I think I've had that experience once where I was like, oh, this is a culture that I'm not comfortable being part of, and work to get yourself out of that. But for me is really level setting what the expectations are when you first come on board from that leader. I work really hard that if I send an email after hours, and I often do because I'm stuck in meetings all day, and then actually getting the work done happens at the back end. I try to make sure it doesn't send till 8 a.m. the next morning, because otherwise it's hitting someone's inbox who might have already gone to bed. But if they see it, even if I say, hey, no pressure, don't reply, I'm in a position of authority, and I understand that might spike somebody's blood pressure, So making sure I'm careful about when I'm sending communications, or if something is a low pressure ask, please don't spend more than 5 minutes on this. Like, trying to express, I think, the level of effort and worry and concern that needs to go into something, so if you need to respond in a very timely manner. That's been a huge thing for me as a leader, because I've been in positions where, someone would never actually ask or expect the level of response I was providing, but I felt like it was assumed I had to. So I think being open and honest about what those expectations are is very important to start with, because I think there's a lot of unspoken expectations on both sides that maybe are just never met, and there's burdens felt because it's not communicated.
My team at work, we've started moving to sprint planning, and part of that is now we track like how much level of effort each single task takes. And it's so funny because no one in our team knows how to gauge that, because we've been so long in the mindset of, I'll just work until you tell me it's good enough, or I'll work until I think it's good enough for my boss or whoever I'm giving this product to. And it's really not that deep.
That effort gauging is very hard. I've gone through multiple efforts to turn marketing teams agile and go through a lot of that. And I feel like the ones who are really successful are the ones who nail that effort, and they're ones who really communicate about what those expectations need to be. But yeah, the learning to measure effort outside of time or ROI is very difficult.
Yeah.
And everyone's 100% looks different. That's the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
My 100% on some days might look like somebody's 110. My 80% on some days might look like somebody's 100. So I think there's also, as you get to know your team and you understand kind of what they can take on, how broad their shoulders are, not even just work-wise, but stress and pressure-wise. I mean, other people respond very differently to that. So as you start understanding how you respond to those things, communicate that. I think it's, if you have a team that really wants to build to your strengths and values, you understand where you can flex with those things.
Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
I feel like there's not a good segue, but
No.
I feel like there are a few more questions we had more career path related. So I think maybe a struggle that people will find a little later down the line, maybe not in their early career, is when it's the right time to leave whatever you're doing for another role or another company as a whole, and how do you go about doing that? How do you make the decision? How do you weigh like the pros and cons of that? It's a pretty weighty choice that you have to make.
I either get bored or annoyed, and then I have to reflect on if that's a place I'm at or if it's the work I'm doing. That's typically where I need to reevaluate. As long as it's not like a horrific toxic environment where I'm like, hold on, I need to get out of this for other reasons, which I've been in. But for the most part, I think I've learned quite a bit I want to, or I feel confident enough to actually look or think about what's beyond this, or I'm not being challenged. And maybe that's why the last few months I've been, malcontent. Is kind of reflecting on what's making you maybe feel that way first, and then what's the action that you need to take. Like I said, sometimes I've been pushed into it where I've had a teammate who's like, you can do this, you shouldn't be here anymore, and had that conversation, and that's been with the wake-up call. But for the most part, I can feel myself start getting itchy or malcontent, or just not being able to find the value in what I'm doing is typically a sign for me I need to start, at the very least, reevaluating kind of where I'm at and what maybe the next step will look like.
I feel like that's a valuable skill. It's like being able to trust your gut in that situation and know that it's like that thought in your mind is coming from a place of, I know what's best for me, and I know that whatever next opportunity I find will actually be worth it, and it'll be something that I can be happy with.
But you might not be. That's the risk.
Right.
I mean, that's the grass is greener type of conversation. So there has to be a weight where you are making a change, and change is scary. And it may be uncomfortable. And for the first few months, you might think, this was the worst thing I've ever done. Why did I do this? But you're going to learn. And especially if it's an environment where you're like, I think this is just me, right? Like, these are new things. New things are hard. A new job is hard for 12 months, if not more, especially depending on where you're at. So you may not think it was the best move at first. So you have to be, like I said, comfortable with being a little uncomfortable at first. I don't think you can 100% ever say, yes, this is exactly the next move I need to make to win at life or be happy. I think you can have your gut and you can have instincts, and learned a lot from the experience. And I will say, I say this in my late 30s, knowing like 20, 30 years from now, I'm going to look back at myself now and laugh, because even 5 years ago, I feel like I could laugh at the assumptions I made about my life. But you're not always going to know, and you're going to make jumps and make mistakes. And I think having that grace for yourself is really important when you're evaluating that.
I have might feel like a very trivial question because I'm still in college, but how do you balance, like, you're in a role where you're in a team or you're in whatever thing and you want to step up, but it doesn't feel like your place to step up, right? Because maybe it's something that it doesn't align with your future, or you don't feel qualified. Like, how do you go about, I don't know, that feeling and like navigate through the situation?
I think it helps if you know your value system, and it helps if you have self-awareness of what your purpose is. It helps if you understand what you're good at and what you enjoy doing. I think sometimes the most important leaps are ones that where you don't have the permission. When I created a corporate version of the Peace Corps, it's called the Corporate Service Corps. I suggested that very early in my career when I wasn't a manager, I didn't have a budget, I didn't control anything. And the first few times I suggested the idea, I got laughed at. And had I recoiled from that, what eventually became over 5,000 people would have not had the experience that they had to go experience another part of the world and contribute their business skills to a societal issue, and then return to the workplace and have that enhance their professional life. I wouldn't have ended up getting a job teaching here and working with the students I work with every year. And Dia, she would have never have gone to Utah and had the experience she had, which was powerful in all those students. If I hadn't in that moment stood up and say, you know what, this is something I really believe in. I have no authority to suggest this, but I think we should do it. And eventually it sticks. Sometimes it doesn't. But I think if you really truly believe in something, I think you just go for it and put it out there. I think again, it's about taking risk, calculated risk, not just wild risk, but embracing risk every now and then. And I think that those are the moments of growth too, especially when they don't work out. It's great when they do, but it's also really valuable when they don't.
I would also say reflect, and you said it's not your place to ask. Is that an assumption you're making, or has someone told you that? I think one of the huge things I've seen in my career, especially with young women, and I felt it early on, is if you're in the room or new on a team, you assume everyone around you knows more, or at least I did, right? I don't assume anyone wants to hear my comments if I'm on call with more senior leadership. But you're not going to know unless you ask. Like, that's the huge thing. And I think one of the big things that we look for when we're hiring is people, we say self-starter, right? But really, it's, I see a need for this. I see this project. You haven't asked for it. Someone else hasn't identified it, but like, I'm passionate about it. And it might be outside of scope for my current role. But that might be the thing that really gets you over the line in your next review, is because you did pull that up and self-start. So I would say the first hurdle is when you ask yourself, is it my place? Is that just you questioning versus, something that's been explicitly stated within your roles or guidelines? And obviously, if asking the question is going to get you penalized, like, there's things to reflect on there. But, I don't know, and maybe there are, but I don't know many managers who, if you were to come to them and say, hey, I want to take on more work, do either you have a project that I could do that, or I think there might be this one, that won't at least have a conversation about that or acknowledge that that's somewhere you're looking at. At least the good ones, I think, should.
Okay, I think we've been recording for quite some time. So, in terms of wrapping up, I think our kind of final question is probably heard this one a lot, but what is one thing that you wish you did know when you were in our shoes, just starting out, fresh out of college? Something you know now.
Life is going to be messier than you assume it is. It's just not this straight line. I mean, there's going to be so many things that impact you down the road, and you're just going to be so different. You just are. And I everyone tells you that, but I feel like until you step into that, you really don't embrace it. And I wish I had embraced things being messy or me not knowing things early on and was more vulnerable and braver. But I think that's hard when you don't know what you don't know when you're young. But yeah, I wish I had been braver earlier.
That's a good point.
I don't know. I mean, I was so clueless, but blissfully so, as a young person, that the list of things I could have shared with myself then is pretty long. I would say probably the one, I think there's a sense that people think that because the way college is considered in our culture, like when you finish college, all right, that's kind of who you are. And it's approximately fixed in terms of your personality and your mindset. And there's actually some interesting research that was done at Harvard about how people think that, oh, this is just who I am. And I forget the actual percentage, but I believe it's over 80% of people, and this is a longitudinal study 40 years later, had dramatically changed and evolved their personality. And so it's just to recognize that you have no idea what you're going to be. And you have no idea what direction you're going to grow. So just let it kind of unfold and not worry too much. I mean, I definitely had some moments of panic attack. Just I made no money in my 20s. I made nothing. And I would have moments where I'm like, I got nothing. Like what society says you're supposed to. I've got nothing.
Right.
But I had so many rich experiences
Mhm.
that have benefited me the whole rest of my life since then. But just that the malleability we have in who we are as people there's a lot of opportunity for growth. So you're not. It's not game over when you're 22. You're not who you're always going to be.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea that we are going to change so much is both terrifying but also reassuring.
Mhm.
It gives you some hope, I guess.
I'll say
Whether you like it or not, that's what's going to happen.
True.
And I'll say I love who I'm changing into.
Mm.
I don't think I would have envisioned this for myself down the road, but the confidence that has come with all the decisions and changes means that I know more things are going to change, and I feel confident to step up for those things. And that's probably going to be the boost in my career that gets me going, because I'm willing to step up because I'm not necessarily afraid of that change. And that's incremental failures and building and successes. And you guys have so much of that in your future.
Good to know. Well, I think that wraps up the episode. So thank you both for coming on the podcast and just letting us pick your brains for almost 2 hours.
Sure.
It's been delightful.
Yes, and giving us really, really rich advice that we don't normally hear in our lives because we're surrounded by other college students. So seriously, thank you a lot for making time and talking to us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our little two-parter with our guests. We enjoyed having our conversations with them. I feel like we learned a lot, and the episode turned into more than just strict career path.
Yeah, it was filled with life lessons and advice that we don't normally get.
Yeah.
So it was a very rewarding and learning experience for us. So I hope you guys also enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, and with that, we'll see you next Sunday because we post every Sunday.
Yes.
You can see our faces on YouTube. You can also listen along on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, anywhere you can find podcasts except where you can't. And, of course, you can follow along with us on Instagram at Small Step Society Pod. And with that, we'll see you next week.
Bye.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.